Welcome, my dear friends. It's great to see you again. In case we haven't been introduced, I'm Stephen Clements, a writer, gamer, and an appreciator of big brain activities. And on this channel, I perform dramatic story readings, I provide role-playing game and movie reviews, and I get to talk to interesting people. And in this episode, we're combining a couple of those elements in that we're going to be doing a review of another chapter of Gary Gygax's role-playing mastery book, and in such a way we're able to pull from the mind of the creator. So it's kind of an interrogation, kind of an interview of his thoughts. And if you haven't seen the other episodes in this series, I've got them on a playlist. You could just start at the preface and catch up. I've enjoyed it, got a lot out of it, and it's influenced my trajectory in the role-playing game hobby. It's encouraged me to do more and to be more. And hopefully, it can do the same for you. In this episode, we're going into Chapter 8, Designing Your Own Game. And he would probably know a few things about that. Someone who achieves mastery as a GM does not actually need to design his own RPG to qualify for that status. However, a master GM will quite probably have the knowledge to accomplish this ultimate feat of creativity in the role-playing game field, and a master should certainly understand and appreciate the concepts of RPG design, whether or not he chooses to put that knowledge into practice. This chapter is especially for those who do have the desire to try their hand at full-fledged game design, and also for those who want to deepen their understanding of just how a good role-playing game is structured and built. Although it is not a full treatise on designing role-playing games, for such a piece of work could comprise a book all by itself, this chapter should be required reading for the sake of the basic guidance it provides, to prevent the would-be designer from getting off on the wrong foot and having to backtrack later. Before a single rule is written or even thought about, the designer must make three important decisions concerning his game to be: its genre, its period, and its scope. Genre is the basic idea of gameplay considered. It can be science fiction, fantasy, espionage, or any of a host of others. The principal genres of RPGs and their salient features are described in Chapter 6. Personal preference is the key to this decision, and the likes and dislikes of your player group are the secondary factor. The player's preferences are placed second for a very important reason. You, as designer and future GM of the game you create, must know and be dedicated to the design subject, or else the game will suffer accordingly. A poor design based on a very popular genre will be rejected. An excellent offering on a subject that has little popularity will at worst bring enjoyment when played by the few who are attracted to the genre. As will be seen later, choice of genre is not limited to one of the basic types. The genre of your game may be a mixture of properties taken from more than one of the basic types, or a hybrid that lies somewhere apart from and between them. Period refers essentially to the time period the game will take place within, and this decision also encompasses the underlying assumptions that will be accepted as facts for the time period when the game is supposed to take place. For instance, in a science fiction game, the period might be the near future, the far future, or somewhere in between. The amount of technological differences in the rules will be affected by the time choice. Can we travel faster than light? Are there planet-destroying beams? Is matter transmission possible? Similarly, in the fantasy genre, the period selection relates to the basis for the laws that will govern the game reality. What mythos is used? How powerful is magic? What sort of creatures exist? Finally, espionage as a genre must also consider time. Are we considering spying in the 1930s and 1940s? What about current espionage? In fact, spies have been around for about as long as wars, so we can work well into the past or project into the future, but not in one single game. Scope is critical because it tells us where play is to begin and where it is to go. Do players begin by commanding fleets of starships? Do they start their game existences as mighty demigods in the mold of Hercules, as the master spies of all time? If the PC's beginnings are too lofty, then you have the possibly insoluble problem of determining where they progress to as the game goes on. If their beginnings are more modest, then you will probably have an easier time deciding how and to where they progress. The choice of scope and how you deal with the attendant questions and problems of what happens next will play a crucial part in determining how much of an ongoing nature the game campaign will have. Let's assume you've opted for a combination of all three genres mentioned. You'll do a science fiction espionage game with a fantasy component. It will take place on Earth, primarily, in the near future, and the fantasy elements will be a mixture of mental powers, extrasensory perception, telekinesis, and such, and magic, some actually vested in the natives of the world, such as voodoo, and some bestowed by alien demon-like beings in return for total commitment to their evil ways. Sounds lit. The player characters will start as good guys who are recruited to become agents charged with the duty of fighting against the vile beings from elsewhere, and those evil governments and persons who are in league with them. Exactly where the PCs will progress to is undetermined at this point, but the chosen scope is small enough to be manageable. In all likelihood, their paths of progression will end short of the point at which they gain enough power to be in control of a government. Writing the rules. Now it's time to figure out how to build a role-playing game to fit the genres, period, and scope selected for play. The major considerations for rules themselves are these: technological base, game area, timescales, distance scales, movement, combat at a distance, hand-to-hand combat, morale, player character generation, non-player character generation, opponents, reward system for progression, and specifics of unknown or unreal weapons and powers. Although most of these elements are relatively self-explanatory, and many of them have been treated in some detail in Chapter 5, let's take a brief look at each facet to make certain it is understood. Technological base is a catch-all term encompassing just about everything we take for granted. Our technological base in the real world includes radio, television, computers, jet aircraft, and so forth. What is the base we will use in our hypothetical game? Since it is set in the near future, it won't be too hard to extrapolate from present-day reality. This world of the near future will have better means of communication, faster travel, slightly better weapons, better medicine, better means of disguise. If we place the action 100 years from now, it should be fairly easy to manage this factor, yet we have gone far enough into the future to make it possible to rationalize the existence of any sort of technology, orbiting space stations for instance, that we need to make the game work. Game area, also known as the milieu, covers where the action will take place. In our model, it would be assumed that the political divisions of Earth will have altered quite a bit in the 100 years from then to now in game terms. We presume the existence of space stations orbiting Earth, a base on the moon, and mining operations taking place in the asteroid belt. The game area takes all these realities into account. Play will range across and around Earth, into the space stations, and onto the moon, Mars perhaps, and the asteroids. Even with such a vast area in which game activity can take place, the door is still open to expansion of the milieu as gameplay goes on. Perhaps in the not-so-near future, technology will improve to make travel to the outer reaches of the solar system possible. Someday, if the game and the campaign remain viable long enough, PCs may use interstellar travel and actually take on the evil aliens on their home planet. Expansion of milieu in a developing, growing game is likely and good. Timescales come in several sizes, all of which will be used by the GM to help determine what can be done and how long it takes to perform a certain task. The game system must consider how to measure time during periods of inactivity by PCs, time in getting to where action is to take place, time during non-confrontational play, and time during combat. In fact, the latter might be well subdivided into time during space travel and time during other forms of combat. The timescales must be fixed in order to determine rules for movement, but time is only one part of this equation. Distance scales tells us how far a person or vehicle can move in the various time intervals chosen. It's fine to start with a basic assumption. In a week, let us say, anyone can travel anywhere. Okay, but how far can someone or something move in a day? What of the travelers on foot, on the back of a mount, in a land vehicle, a watercraft, or a spaceship? And again, how much distance can any of those forms of transportation cover in a period of a minute, 10 seconds, 1 second? What sorts of actions can be taken in the shorter intervals of time? Answers to questions like these will be paramount in selecting the distance scales, your measurement intervals for the game. The distance scales are the other half of the equation needed for determination of movement rules. Movement can be defined and quantified once the time and distance scales are known. Obviously, there must be varying systems of measurement in a game that considers the wide range of speeds and distances we are talking about. Perhaps movement is too narrow a term for this element, for it involves much more than simply traveling from one place to another. Along with literal movement come a host of other activities that are considered within the realm of time and space. Starting engines, gathering speed, shooting weapons, detecting enemies, sending messages, and much more need to be quantified within the overall time/distance/movement framework. Combat at a distance considers all forms of weapons that can hit targets from more than 10 meters distance, let us say. The weapons involved range from gigantic lasers and particle beams to the simple projectiles that are expelled from crossbows and blowguns. In addition to defining the weapons themselves in physical terms, we must also address the questions of detection devices and their ranges, communications range, rate of fire, and how much damage these weapons cause to various materials. Sighting, screening, and defensive considerations such as armor are also part of this section of the rules. Hand-to-hand combat, also known as combat at close quarters or simply melee, deals with various handheld striking weapons, projectile weapons used, if the circumstances permit, in close quarters, and non-weapon combat, barehanded blows, kicks, holds, and so forth. Number of attacks possible, defenses, and damage are considered here. Morale concerns the mental effect on allies and enemies of certain events during the course of near combat or combat. It does not apply to PCs, but it must be used for special non-player characters, ordinary personages, soldiers, bystanders, etc., and creatures that are able to be affected by events. Rules for morale address much more than simply whether a character or creature runs away from conflict or combat. Certain factors can contribute to high morale, meaning that the character or creature actually advances or attacks instead of hesitating or retreating. Reaction is a good alternative name for this concept. Typical events that influence the morale or reaction of an ally or adversary are one side or the other taking heavy losses, being surrounded, losing or winning some key thing, or the triumph or death of a leader. When you are devising rules to cover morale or reaction, remember that someone or something must have at least a modicum of intelligence to evidence a reaction in some cases. For instance, fire might frighten beasts away by its mere presence, if the beasts are smart enough to know what fire is and what it can do, but stupid creatures won't be frightened until the fire burns them. Attitude also plays a big part. Disloyal troops might leave at the first excuse, such as the sight of the enemy, while troops that are fanatically loyal to their cause might battle to the last man despite any occurrence that might discourage the less fervent. This can be a broad rules area if the designer so chooses, but in a role-playing game it must never be used for characters actually played by game participants. Only the players of those PCs are in a position to know what their characters' reactions will be. If the game includes rules that force PCs to behave in a certain way in a given situation, then in this respect at least, it is not a true role-playing game. Player character generation is one of the most critical portions of any RPG. At the root of everything, a character is no more and no less than a set of numbers, each of which refers to the value or amount of a certain ability or characteristic that the character possesses. Those numbers are normally generated by rolling dice, and then the dice scores are assigned to various attributes, physical prowess, intelligence, cunning, charisma, whatever, that describe the makeup of the character. Dice are used either singly to generate a number in a linear probability progression, 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 for instance, with one 10-sided or 20-sided die respectively, or in combination of 2 or more rolls to produce results on a curve, 2 to 12 from the total of 2 6-sided dice, 2 to 20 from 2 10-sided dice, and so on. With the former method, a high score for an attribute is just as likely as a low score. In the latter system, the very highest and very lowest scores are quite rare, and most results will be in the middle range. The system you use will depend on how much significance a character's attributes have in the overall scheme of things and what the nature of those attributes is. Generally, a system that determines attributes by a linear probability also allows for attributes to be increased or decreased during play, so that a character is not necessarily hampered for life by an unlucky low score in some area, and not necessarily forever invincible just because the original score was a high one. Conversely, attribute scores assigned to the total of multiple dice rolls are more or less fixed at their original level for the life of the character, or it takes relatively much more time and effort to effect a change. This is not a hard and fast tenet, but it is a good line of reasoning to follow when setting up your character generation system. The generated attributes of PCs help quantify just what a character can and cannot do, or how difficult it is for him to perform some task. Obviously, the physically stronger of two PCs should have a better chance of bashing down a door or lifting a boulder, for instance, while the more intelligent of the two will have an easier time figuring out how some strange weapon or piece of technology is operated. Another important part of character generation is how a character's specific abilities, as opposed to attributes, will be expressed. In Chapter 5, the differences between a class-based system and a skill-based system were briefly described. Essentially, these are your choices. Will characters be slotted into certain professions or classes, or will each one be expressed as a unique combination of different skills? It is possible, as was pointed out in the earlier passages on this subject, to devise a system that includes aspects of both of these methodologies. What you decide to do about this issue will have a direct bearing on questions regarding the reward system and character progression. See page 147. Other decisions pertaining to the nature of characters must be made as part of this section of rules. How will the game account for people and creatures of differing moral and ethical outlooks? Are beings either good or evil, or are there other divisions and categories between those extremes that deserve distinction? The AD&D game uses a spectrum of 9 different alignments, ranging from lawful good, the goodest of the good guys, to chaotic evil, the baddest of the bad. Your system may be this complex, or your game milieu may be such that fewer shades of gray need to be defined between the extremes of black and white. How will you quantify a character's or creature's ability to suffer injury or absorb damage without being killed? Most role-playing games use some form of system based on hit points. Weapons and other things that injure or damage each cause the victim to lose a certain number of hit points from a predetermined maximum, and if a victim's hit point total reaches 0, he is dead. Generally, a hit point system is structured so that a character with higher scores in the physical attribute areas will have relatively more hit points than a character whose best attribute scores are in the mental and psychological areas. All character attributes assist the participants in one of the singular features of these games: role-playing. If a dice score indicates that a character has a low degree of cunning, for instance, then the player of that character is obliged to do his best to portray the character in that vein when that particular attribute comes into play during a scenario. A character whose alignment is basically good should be role-played in a markedly different way from one whose outlook is neutral or evil. The generation and initial development of the character prior to actual play is very necessary. Indeed, without a sophisticated and comprehensive system for character generation, we would have a role assumption rather than a role-playing game. In some games, character generation is a very tedious and time-consuming process that puts off even old hands at gaming. This can be alleviated to some extent, I believe, by careful and clever rule design and some imaginative methods of keeping action and adventure in the process of statistical generation and the recording of character information. Non-player character generation will generally follow the methods used to create PCs. However, there are necessary shortcuts and parcels of information included in a carefully done game, or else the poor GM will be forever immersed in the morass of finding out the precise nature of who his players meet, who opposes them, and the like. It should not be necessary for the GM to roll dice to determine all the attribute scores of every non-player character, for instance. The game must include provisions for defining NPCs so they can be generated quickly, but without causing every such character to be a mirror image of every other one. Although it is a relatively short and minor part of any game, this area is still interesting, where it will show just how well thought out the design is. Opponents are the creatures and things that will generally be adverse, at best non-hostile, to the PCs. Enemy NPCs fall into this category, but have already been considered in the preceding paragraph. The flora and fauna of the game milieu, the detection devices used to spot them, booby traps, enemy weapons, and the like are covered in this broad area. Anything that can be encountered and must thereafter be dealt with should be quantified in this section of the rules. How much damage does a certain creature cause when it attacks, and how many hit points of damage can it absorb before it is killed? Do certain creatures normally appear in groups or singly? Is a certain creature more likely to be found in one type of terrain or climate than another? If a creature or character falls into a pit or is buffeted by an avalanche of rocks, how much damage does the victim suffer? If a plant has leaves that are poisonous, what effect do they have on a character or creature that ingests them? This area of the rules can be very, very broad in a science fiction or fantasy game. In the AD&D game, 3 full-size books are devoted entirely to brief descriptions of the plants and animals that may populate the game world, and it is a fairly easy matter for someone familiar with the game to devise his own creations to replace or supplement this roster. That is one of the charms of selecting a genre that is not tied very closely to the real world. There is always a new alien beast or race, a new monster to discover and deal with. Reward system for progression refers to the method by which a PC will gain for successfully completing a mission or quest or case. In a class-based character system, experience points are typically awarded to signify advancement in one's profession. In such systems, various added benefits are acquired by accumulation of these points as characters advance from one level to a higher level in the chosen class. In a skill-based game, each success is rewarded by giving the character an opportunity to add to his knowledge base with a new skill, enhance his ability in an existing skill, or improve one of his specific attributes. Not a few designs use a little of both systems to give a third approach. No matter how your system for rewards and progression is set up, one factor is critical. The size or value of the reward must always be tailored to the scope of the accomplishment for which the reward is given. If big rewards are gained too easily, or if characters have to stare death in the face just to get a crumb tossed to them by the GM, then it is safe to assume that the game has a considerable flaw. Unless the GM is most capable, the activity will quickly become an exercise in either boredom or futility, and in either case, players may decide to give up the game rather than put up with it. This is a major area for the designer to consider in his efforts. Specifics. If your game's technological base includes such items as an ultra-modern tank or a magic wand, it's not enough simply to stipulate that these things exist. Because they will come into play, facts need to be known about them, facts that must be incorporated into the game design. The tank must be described in terms of its speed, armor, weapons, range, crew, perhaps data pertaining to sighting and tracking equipment, not a body of information that anyone is likely to have in his head. So these facts must be researched and then incorporated into the rules. As for the wand, what sort of magical effect does it exude? Is it small enough to be concealed in a pouch or a pocket? How often or how many times can it be used before its power is depleted? These specifications must come from the imagination of the designer, whose conclusions are tempered by other facts about the game world and what he wants the overall game design to accomplish. At the other extreme, how is a simple modern-day flashlight described in game terms? Only a little information is needed, its type, its battery power, and that should do it. If there arise any questions about range or duration of its illumination, the object's fragility, and so forth, the GM, who may be, but will not necessarily be, the designer himself, can handle them because he is at least basically familiar with what such an item is capable of. The point is this: when we move backward in time, forward into imaginary time, or into a world of fantasy, we have less and less hard information to draw upon. As our internal information base shrinks, we must substitute an external one. Thus, the further removed from reality the RPG is, the larger must be the information base that provides the GM and players with specifics of unknown or unreal weapons and powers. If the genre, period, and scope of the game are removed from present-day reality and sufficient information of this sort is not incorporated into the rules, a master GM can manage very well indeed on a dab of this and a spattering of that, but only if he is willing and capable enough to provide the specifics himself and in so doing develop his own variant of the game. If he is compelled to do this often enough, his version of the game will quickly become a very personalized design, and unless the GM records and reuses the specifics he creates, a design that is likely to alter from time to time as memory fails, and one that no other GM could possibly duplicate. Thus, it should come as no surprise that requiring the GM to supply a lot of specific information results in a game that is highly unpalatable to most other participants, the players, especially those who are currently taking part in more than one campaign based on the same game, because when the differences and specifics are considered, the game is not the same game after all. A well-designed RPG will include a lot of specific information, so that various campaigns utilizing the same set of rules will have much in common, regardless of how different the campaigns might be, and to avoid the unpleasant situations that occur when a GM is forced to do game design work in addition to campaign design work. Those are the components that go into the design of a role-playing game. Think about them for a bit, then go to your favorite RPG and see how the information given here fits when it is applied to the actual design. Modify the advice given here according to your tastes. Then take all the systems and approaches you like from your favorite game and discard all the rest. Hopefully, there will be at least 3/4 of the original game remaining. If not, go to your second favorite game and see if you have better results. If that doesn't work, start your own game from scratch. You'll now examine the portions you do not like. Take these apart paragraph by paragraph, table by table, and see what makes the rules tick. That way you'll be able to zero in on exactly what you don't feel comfortable with in the design. Now you're ready to write your own rules to replace those you've excised from the game. The 3/4 recommendation was given for a good reason. No existing game design can suffer extensive revision without becoming either radically different or totally unplayable. For example, as I related near the end of Chapter 3 in a different context, a few years ago the use of spell points became vogue, not to say faddish. The Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game system was criticized for not using spell points. Avid tinkerers rushed to get their particular method of using spell points into print. I was vilified, pointed at as a reactionary, possibly a despot, when I vocally resisted the notion that a spell point system would fit into the AD&D game. Not only is such a system incongruous, I asserted, but its inclusion would destroy the campaign. The AD&D game has a magic system that provides powerful spells to low-level PCs. This allows them to be viable characters at low levels of experience. Since the spells any character can use are limited in number and in the level, power, of their magic, game balance is maintained as characters gain experience and become able to cast more powerful spells. In the design, magic-using PCs have memorized the spells they will carry during the course of their adventure, and once it is used, the spell usually cannot be recalled. In contrast, a spell point system operates on the notion of magical energy. You have X points of magical energy. Which spell you use is immaterial so long as the energy remains. Although such a rule eliminates the necessity of planning and considering what might occur during the course of an adventure, it is a viable system if the spells designed to be used with it are aimed at the governing energy level concept. The characters using them are restricted in their selection of potential castings, and the whole of the design is written not to merely accommodate spell points, but to utilize the concept with respect to other actions. How about mental power points, physical power points? The idea is sound, and characters in such a game should be structured to utilize it in all its extrapolations. For those who are interested, by the way, the concept of using spell points as part of the AD&D game withered away when it was ascertained that in such a setup, players tended to desire the invincible magic user as a PC. Campaigns did indeed die and have to be reinstituted on the old basis of spell memorization as per the rules. In fact, spell points are not very highly regarded these days. That's a shame, for the mechanics and rationale behind the concept are fine. All that is needed is a game designed to use the approach. Keep this in mind as you design or revise rules for your own game creation. A good RPG is a complex mesh of many factors. Get the rules gears out of synchronization and the vehicle grinds to a halt. After you have outlined the new portions you believe will make the overall design superior, begin testing them with your player group. Listen to the players' comments and criticisms, and as you develop and finalize rules, adjust them for such input. When you've fleshed out the materials so that you have a set of rules on paper comparable to a professional game, the final playtesting can begin. For example, the Dungeons & Dragons game grew out of the Chainmail Fantasy Rules Supplement. It took about 1 year to have the prototype of the D&D game tested sufficiently to put it into print. However, by the time it was published, January 1974, the system had grown and changed so much already as to require more fleshing out with the Greyhawk supplement as soon as possible. Of course, when the first supplement was done, we found the game was ready for more, and the booklets entitled Blackmoor and Eldritch Wizardry came along. Now ground is no longer being broken in the D&D game rules. They are as complete and as comprehensive as they need to be. But since that first RPG was created and developed, there have been scores of similar games published, and design and development of rules, or even a completely new game, is no longer difficult. There are many tried and tested models to select from. Nonetheless, it will take a few months of intense play for you to know if your rules are complete and adequate. There is more reason for doing this than an exercise in creativity. If you can actually design and develop rules and systems that work, you can easily understand and analyze other works. You can then be a better player, a better game master, and even a better designer. This is not to say that you need to create your own game or game system, but by knowing how to do so, you can take a design that is good but flawed and correct the weak areas, retaining the basic elements of the system and enabling your group to continue to find entertainment in its play. Master player, master GM, and master designer are roles that are very close to one another. Few, if any of us, can agree on all three. Still, each of these roles is such that the individuals who actually qualify in one category or another understand and assist the others. The master player accommodates the master GM, the master GM the master player, and both accommodate the game design they have selected. The master game designer must accommodate both player and GM, of course, so his role is more difficult in that regard. Standing apart from all three types of masters is the rare individual who deserves, indeed requires, further distinction as a Grand Master. And that was Chapter 8. So, I want to go ahead and pick a beef with something that Gary said in this chapter about decrying game mechanics that force players to role-play their characters in a certain way, but then in the very next paragraph it goes on talking about the essential attributes, like ability scores, that should determine how a player plays their character. And a lot of players, they get real mad when something happens to them that objectively should force or dictate how their character would progress, what their reaction would be to a certain thing. Getting hit with a fear spell, getting hit with a charm spell, getting hit with any sort of enchantment, charm, enthrallment. In the vampire game, uses of presence, things like that, love potions. Each of those things have an in-game effect that compels action that the character would not normally take. And I guarantee you, those players have no problems using those effects on non-player characters. But when you do it to them, they get awful upset about it, and that's kind of crap. But then Gary went on to talk about how ability scores should dictate how a character is played by the player, which makes a lot of sense. If you have, say, in a Dungeons & Dragons game, an intelligence of 5 on your character, objectively, that character is pretty dumb. But some players will look at a stat, say, I don't want to play it like that, so I'm just going to play this guy like me, and I'm much smarter than that, so I'm going to do it anyway. Well, effectively, that player is cheating at the game. That character doesn't have a genius intelligence. That character doesn't have a high charisma that would make everybody fall in love with them. And so on the one hand, Gary says don't force characters to do certain things, but then that character should be shaped by game mechanics. And players out there, I just want to give you some direction here that will improve your performance of the table and the experience your dungeon master or game master gets out of such situations with you. If your character gets charmed or mentally dominated by a demon, a vampire, an enchantress, anything like that, and the DM gives you role-playing directions of, okay, this is what's happening to your character, I need you to act in accordance with that, follow the role-playing directions. You're playing the role of someone who is charmed by this unnatural or supernatural power. Run with it. Don't be a bitch who engages in all the malicious compliance in the world, drags their feet, stomps their feet, whines, and does everything they can to foil the effects of the game. Sometimes that's what the cards do to you. And as I said, I've never seen a player whine when their powers took effect on an NPC. Turnabout is fair play. Remember, this isn't you. This is a game. Play the game. So that was one gripe I had there. And then also when he was talking about role-playing games and how many changes do you make to a game before it's not the same game at all. As I've mentioned when I've talked about 5th edition in the past, a problem it has is that it's one note. It doesn't come up with new challenges, just bigger bags of hit points that go with the challenges that it already gives you. And I saw all kinds of design flaws that lead to that outcome. So me and my New Hampshire friends, we brainstormed and came up with all kinds of different ways to fix that and to make a very challenging game. But by the end of it, it's not the same game. It has a different approach, so scope. It's not heroic fantasy, it's gritty survivalism, which was just better suited to older editions of D&D. And that's why we went back to play that. So there's a lot to think about in this one. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are, so please drop them in the comments. I'd love to read them. And maybe share this around to some of your other role-playing friends and see what they have to say. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe. And until next time, my dear, dear friends, I wish you nothing but the best.